In the vast, silent plains of Canaan, a promise hung by the thinnest of threads, worn fragile by the friction of time and the weight of human doubt. For 13 long years, the heavens had been sealed. Not a whisper from the whirlwind, not a vision in the night, not a dream from the Almighty. For 13 agonizing years, a man named Abram, the friend of God, had walked under a blistering, indifferent sun, the divine echo of a universe-altering promise fading into a distant, almost imaginary memory. He was 99 years old, a patriarch teetering on the precipice of a century, his body stooped with age, his spirit parched by the drought of divine silence. The promise that had propelled him out of the sophisticated paganism of Ur of the Chaldees, the promise of a son from his own body, of a nation as numerous as the stars glittering in the Mesopotamian sky, now seemed as barren and desolate as his beloved wife's 90-year-old womb. This was not a crisis born of sudden tragedy, but one slowly and meticulously crafted by the relentless passage of time. Time is the enemy of promises that defy nature. Every sunrise that brought another day of old age, every new moon that marked another month of Sarai's enduring barrenness, was a quiet sermon preaching the gospel of impossibility. In the ancient world, a man's legacy, his very name and existence beyond the grave, was carried in the life of his son. Childlessness was not a private sorrow. It was a public shame, a sign of insignificance, often interpreted as a curse from the gods. The pressure on Abram was immense, a crushing weight on his soul. And so, in the suffocating silence of God, the desperate logic of man had found its voice. Sarai, his princess, had looked at her own frail body and the customs of her time and devised a plan, a pragmatic plan, a plan of the flesh. The Lord has kept me from having children, she had reasoned. Go, sleep with my slave, perhaps I can build a family through her. This was the birth of Ishmael, the son of the flesh, a son born not of divine promise, but of human presumption, a son born from the attempt to help God, to use the tools of human culture to construct a divine destiny. For 13 years, Abram had raised Ishmael. He had watched him grow from an infant to a boy of 13. He surely loved him, and perhaps, in the deepest recesses of his heart, he had convinced himself that this was it. This was the compromised fulfillment of God's promise, the best one could hope for in a world governed by the unyielding laws of nature. He had a son, an heir. The shame of childlessness was lifted, but the silence from God was a deafening rebuke, a quiet, thundering testament that the clever plan of man was not, and could never be, the holy covenant of God. Many read this ancient story and see a simple historical account, a cultural narrative about names and rituals. But what if I told you that within this single chapter, Genesis 17, lies the secret architecture of faith itself? What if this encounter reveals a blueprint for a relationship with God so profound, so earth-shattering, that its shockwaves would define the course of all human history? What if the events of this one day reveal not just a plan for one aging patriarch, but the very nature of God Almighty and his ultimate, unstoppable plan for the redemption of all humanity? Today, we will excavate the layers of this sacred text. We will unravel the mystery hidden in plain sight, a mystery of a new name that rewrites destiny, a bloody sign that prophesies a greater sacrifice, and the impossible laughter that would forever seal a covenant between an all-powerful God and his flawed, faithful friend. Stay with us, because what God revealed to Abraham in his moment of deepest spiritual exhaustion is a living truth that has the power to shatter the impossibilities in your own life today. The profound stillness of Abram's life was shattered in an instant, the mundane reality of a desert afternoon torn asunder by the raw presence of the divine. The narrative is stark, almost shockingly abrupt. The Lord appeared to Abram. This was no gentle whisper. This was a theophany, a direct, stunning, and terrifying manifestation of the living God. And when God spoke, he did not introduce himself by the covenant name Abram had known before, YHWH. He chose a name specifically for this moment, a name that was a direct assault on the fortress of impossibility that Abram and Sarai had built around their hearts. He said, "I am El Shaddai." In our modern world, we treat ancient names as little more than historical artifacts. But to Abram, a man of the ancient East, these two words would have struck with the force of a thunderclap, resonating with layers of profound meaning. El Shaddai. It is often translated simply as God Almighty, but this translation, while correct, is tragically incomplete. It strips the name of its visceral, earthy power. The Hebrew root shad is directly linked to a mother's breast, the source of nourishment, sustenance, comfort, and life-giving power. The name is also linked to the Akkadian word shadu, meaning mountain, a timeless symbol of unshakable strength, permanence, and majesty. So when God declares himself El Shaddai, he is making a multifaceted, breathtaking claim. He is saying, "I am the nourishing one, the God who can bring life from barrenness, who can make a dry womb overflow with life, just as a mother's breast overflows with milk. And I am the unshakable one, the God of the mountain, whose power is ancient and absolute, who is not bound by the natural laws I myself have created." For 13 years, Abram had lived by the cold, hard logic of the flesh, the logic of aging cells and declining strength. Now, in a single declaration, El Shaddai appears to announce that the logic of the flesh is utterly irrelevant in his presence. His power, his nourishment, his mountain-like strength, and his alone would be the force that fulfilled this covenant. Following this staggering declaration of identity, El Shaddai gives a command that cuts to the very heart of Abram's 13-year spiritual drift. "Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." This command is the foundation upon which the entire covenant will be rebuilt. Walk before Mehithalek Lephani. The language suggests more than just good behavior. It implies a life lived in a state of constant, conscious awareness of God's presence. It is a call to a restored Edenic intimacy, a stark contrast to Adam and Eve who, after their sin, hid from God's presence. Abram is being called to live in the light, with his entire existence oriented towards God. The plan with Hagar was a walking after human wisdom, a scheme concocted in the shadows of doubt. Now, he is called to walk before the face of God. And the second part of the command, "Be blameless," wehye tamim, is equally profound. The Hebrew word tamim is the same word used to describe an unblemished animal fit for sacrifice. It means to be whole, complete, sound, a thing of integrity. It was not a call to achieve sinless perfection, which God knew was impossible. It was a call to wholeheartedness. It was a command to stop dividing his loyalties between God's promise and his own backup plans. He was to consecrate himself entirely to God, to become a living sacrifice, a concept the Apostle Paul would echo millennia later. Then, the covenant promise is laid bare, not as a negotiation between two parties, but as a sovereign, unilateral decree from the Almighty. "I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers." The initiative is entirely God's. Abram's response was the only one possible. He fell face down. In the presence of El Shaddai, the God of the mountain, there is no ground for human pride, no platform for argument. There is only awe, surrender, and the soul-crushing, liberating realization of one's own smallness before the infinite. It was in this posture of complete and total humility that God bestowed upon him the first great secret of the renewed covenant, a new identity, spoken into existence. "No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." This is one of the most powerful and misunderstood moments in all of Scripture. This was no mere honorary title. In the ancient world, a name was a person's essence, their character, their destiny. Abram meant exalted father. It was a noble name, a name of respect. But Abraham was a creative, performative act of God. God takes the Hebrew word for multitude, or throng hamonand, embeds it directly into Abram's name. He becomes Avraham, literally the father of a multitude. Consider the sheer audacity of this moment. God does not say, "I will make you a father of many nations." He says, "I have made you." It is a done deal. He speaks in the perfect tense, declaring a future certainty as a past accomplishment. At that moment, Abraham, the newly named, had one son by an Egyptian slave girl and an elderly, barren wife. To the outside world, calling him father of a multitude was not just hopeful, it was ludicrous, an object of potential mockery. But God's covenant does not operate on the world's terms or timelines. This is the principle of prophetic faith. God calls things that are not as though they were. He handed Abraham his future, wrapped in a new name, and commanded him to live in it, to answer to it, to become it by faith, long before it was a tangible reality. Every time someone hailed him, every time he introduced himself, he would be making a public declaration of faith in the absurd promise of God. And this divine act of recreation did not stop with him. The covenant had to be established on two pillars of faith. God then turned his attention to the silent, sorrowful partner in this promise. "As for Sarai, your wife," El Shaddai declared, "you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah." The subtlety here is magnificent. Sarai means my princess. It is possessive, personal, diminutive. She was Abram's princess, the princess of his tent, the princess of his clan. But Sarah means simply princess. The possessive pronoun is dropped. God was elevating her status from the private to the public, from the familial to the universal. She was no longer just one man's princess, she was now a royal matriarch for the entire world. God was conferring upon her a universal dignity and a central role in salvation history. And he confirms this with an explicit, world-altering promise. "I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." At 90 years old, childless, post-menopausal and long past any hope, Sarah was given the identity of a global mother. The promise was made specific in a way it had never been before. The seed must come by her. The plan of the flesh through Hagar was officially and eternally set aside. The line of promise would come through the impossible, through a womb that logic and biology had declared dead, so that all the glory would belong to El Shaddai alone. Then, God introduces the second great secret of the covenant, the physical, permanent sign that would forever mark this incredible promise on the bodies of Abraham's descendants. Circumcision. To our modern sensibilities, this can seem like a strange, even primitive, ritual. But to dismiss it is to miss the theological heart of the covenant. This was no mere tribal marking. It was a sermon etched in flesh, a multi-layered symbol of God's relationship with his chosen people. First, it was a sign of separation. In a world teeming with pagan tribes and their syncretic rituals, this act would physically and visibly distinguish the people of the covenant. It was a constant, outward mark of a profound inward reality. They were set apart for El Shaddai. They did not belong to the gods of Egypt or Canaan or Babylon. They belonged to the one true God. Second, and most profoundly, it was a sign of cutting away the flesh. This is the spiritual core of the act, its deepest secret. The covenant of God could not, and would not, be fulfilled by human effort, by the power of the flesh. Abraham had already tried that with Hagar, and it had resulted in family strife and 13 years of divine silence. Circumcision, the cutting away of the foreskin on the very organ of human generation, was a permanent, physical object lesson. It was a bloody declaration that human self-reliance, fleshly wisdom, and natural ability must be cut away and discarded. To enter into this covenant was to confess that your own strength was insufficient, that you could not generate the promised life on your own. It was a commitment to live by the Spirit of God, not the power of the flesh. The Apostle Paul would later seize on this very imagery, speaking of the circumcision of the heart and warning believers not to put confidence in the flesh. The entire biblical theology of flesh versus spirit finds its seed right here, in this bloody command given to Abraham. Third, It was a sign sealed in blood. In the ancient Near East, the most solemn covenants were sealed by the shedding of blood. Parties would often cut an animal in half and walk between the pieces, invoking a self-malprecatory curse. May it be done to me as was done to this animal if I break this covenant. Here, God commands a sign that involves the shedding of human blood from the very source of life. It was a visceral, unforgettable sign that this promise was sealed with the price of life itself. And for those with eyes to see, it was a prophetic shadow pointing forward to a future day. It prefigured a greater covenant that would be sealed not with the blood of bulls, goats, or even men, but with the precious blood of God's own Son, the ultimate seed of Abraham, who would be cut off, as the prophet Isaiah foretold, for the sins of his people. Finally, the ritual was to take place on the 8th day. The specificity is critical. In biblical numerology, the number 7 represents perfection and completion, as seen in the 7 days of creation. The 8th day, therefore, symbolizes a new beginning, a new creation. By circumcising a child on the 8th day, the parents were declaring that this new life was beginning its journey under the new covenant of God. It was a powerful foreshadowing of resurrection life, as Jesus himself rose from the dead on the 1st day of the week, which is, in sequence, the 8th day, the day of the new creation. Faced with this cascade of stunning revelations, a new powerful name for God, a new destiny-laden name for himself, a new royal identity for his wife, a promise of a son within the year from a barren womb, and a command for a permanent and bloody sign. Abraham's reaction was one of profound, complex, and deeply human emotion. Once again, he fell to the ground, a posture of worship. But this time, something else happened. He laughed. It is easy to judge this laugh as a lapse in faith, a moment of cynical mockery. But the text invites a far deeper reading. This was the laughter of pure, unadulterated astonishment. This was not the hidden, cynical snicker that Sarah would later try to deny. This was an open, full-bodied laugh from a man whose entire logical framework of the world had just been obliterated by the raw, creative power of El Shaddai. Imagine it, a 99-year-old man, his body aged and worn, being told he is about to embark on the journey of fatherhood with a newborn. Imagine him looking at his wife, Sarah, 90 years old, her face a beautiful map of a long and childless life, and being told she would not only bear a son but would become the matriarch of kings. The sheer, glorious, beautiful absurdity of it was overwhelming. It was the laughter of a man pushed past the breaking point of his own reason into the limitless expanse of divine possibility. It was a laugh that said, "This is utterly impossible. And yet, because you are God, it must be absolutely true." But even in that moment of stunned, holy laughter, a flicker of his old fleshly reasoning returned, like a ghost from the past 13 years. His mind, still reeling from the promise of the unseen, grasped for the tangible, for the son he could see and touch, the boy who was at that very moment running through his camp. He lifted his face from the dust and pleaded with God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." It was a loving, poignant, fatherly cry. He loved his firstborn son. But it was also the last gasp of his old way of thinking. It was a desperate plea for God to bless his plan, to sanctify the son of the flesh. It was a final, crucial test. Would Abraham fully and completely embrace the new, impossible divine promise, or would he try to cling to the visible, logical solution he had created himself? God's response was gentle, yet absolutely firm. It was a divine number. He did not dismiss or diminish Abraham's love for Ishmael, but he corrected his understanding of the covenant's sacred architecture. "Yes," God begins, acknowledging the plea, "but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac." The covenant was not a negotiation. It was specific, exclusive, and miraculous by design. It had to come through Sarah, through the dead womb, through the impossible channel, so that no man could ever claim it was the work of human strength or wisdom. And the very name of the child would forever memorialize this moment of holy laughter, Yitzhak, He laughs. Every time Abraham would call his son's name, he would be reminded of his own incredulous laughter and the God who laughs at the concept of human impossibility. And yet, in his infinite and overflowing grace, God did not cast Ishmael aside. He heard the plea of a father's heart. He responded with magnificent generosity. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." God's blessing is not a scarce resource. There is grace and a future even for the son of the fleshly plan. But God immediately follows this generous promise by drawing a clear, unalterable line of distinction. "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." There would be a blessing for Ishmael, but the covenant, the unique, redemptive, world-changing line of promise that would eventually bring forth the Messiah, belonged to Isaac alone. God's purposes are precise. His grace is wide, but his redemptive covenant is narrow. He will not be deterred from his original miraculous plan. When God had finished speaking, when the theophany ended, and the palpable weight of this new reality settled upon the 99-year-old man, Abraham's response became the very definition of living faith. The text gives us a crucial time-stamped detail. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael, and all those born in his household, or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God had told him, on that very day. There was no procrastination. There was no deliberation. There was no calling a council with his elders to discuss the prudence of this strange and painful command. The man who had waited 13 years in spiritual silence now acted with immediate, radical, and costly obedience. He took the sharp flint knife himself. He, the great patriarch, submitted his own aged body to the sign. He brought his beloved son, Ishmael, the 13-year-old boy on the cusp of manhood, and subjected him to this painful ritual. He gathered every single male in his vast household servants born into his clan, allies bought with his money, and brought them all under the bloody sign of the covenant. This was the walking blamelessly that El Shaddai had commanded, brought to life. It was faith not as an abstract belief or a pious feeling, but as a decisive, obedient action. It was the complete alignment of his will with God's will, no matter the cost or the confusion. In one single bloody and painful afternoon, Abraham cut away the past. He cut away his reliance on the flesh. He cut away his old name and his old identity. And he stepped fully and irrevocably into the promise, marking himself and his entire household as belonging to El Shaddai, the God of the impossible. The secret of Genesis 17 is the secret of our own faith journey. It is a timeless blueprint that speaks with roaring power into the barren places of our own lives. It teaches us that God often waits until our situation is utterly, comprehensively impossible from a human perspective before he steps in to reveal his greatest power. He meets us at our point of spiritual and physical barrenness and declares, "I am El Shaddai, the all-sufficient one who needs no help from human schemes." He gives us a new identity in him, just as he renamed Abraham and Sarah. Through Christ he calls us sons and daughters of the King, saints, righteous and holy, long before we feel like it, and certainly before our actions perfectly reflect it. He hands us our eternal destiny and asks us to walk in it by faith, to answer to our new name. And he calls us too to a kind of circumcision, not of the physical body, but the circumcision of the heart. He calls us to take the sharp knife of his word and his spirit and cut away our deep-seated reliance on the flesh, our own plans, our own strength, our own clever solutions that lead only to strife and years of spiritual silence. He asks us to cut away the pride that prevents us from falling on our faces before him and the cynical doubt that makes us laugh in secret. He asks us to embrace the sign of his new covenant, a covenant sealed not with our own imperfect blood, but with the perfect blood of the Lamb, Jesus Christ, the ultimate seed of Abraham. The story of Abraham is the story of every believer. We all have our Ishmaels, the results of our own efforts, the things we cling to because they are visible and make logical sense. And God, in his abundant grace, may bless them in their own way. But his covenant promise, his deepest and best redemptive work in our lives, will always come through Isaac, the thing that is utterly impossible without him. It will come in a way that forces us to laugh with wild astonishment, so that he, and he alone, receives all the glory. So now, as this ancient story settles in your soul, the question turns from the plains of Canaan to the landscape of your own heart. What is the barren place in your life? Where have you quietly, sadly concluded that God's promise is impossible? Is it a broken relationship, a financial wilderness, a spiritual dryness that has lasted for what feels like an eternity? It is precisely in that place of impossibility that El Shaddai wants to appear. What is the Hagar solution that you have been relying on, only to find it leads to a deafening silence from heaven? God is calling you today to cut it away, to embrace the new identity he has given you in Christ, and to walk in the radical, immediate obedience of faith. Do you believe that the God of Abraham is your God? Do you believe he is still El Shaddai, the one who brings life from death and calls things that are not as though they were? Let us know in the comments below what this powerful story means to you. If this revelation of God's covenant has deepened your understanding of his word, give this message a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that with our God, nothing is impossible. And if you were captivated by the secrets hidden within this covenant, then you cannot afford to miss the shocking revelation of what happens next. When God asks Abraham to take his promised son, his beloved Isaac, to the top of a lonely mountain, it is a test that would shake the foundations of the world and provide the single greatest living prophecy of the coming of Christ in the entire Old Testament. Click on the video you see on your screen right now to uncover the mystery of the binding of Isaac. You will never read the Bible the same way again.